Good afternoon. I used to be a teacher. Come on, good afternoon. Thank you. I want to say, first of all, I was talking with James Robertson about having spoken at one of the first RAMBA conferences in what must have been 2000 or 2001, and to see the incredible growth of this. If we had 200 people in the room then, that would have been a lot. To see the incredible growth of RAMBA to, I believe, 1,400 attendees this year is kind of mind-blowing. So I want to thank all of the board members, all of the student organizers, and most especially Matt Kidd for their incredible leadership in growing this organization to where it is today. They definitely deserve a round of applause. And I have to say, I'm nervous in giving this speech for three reasons. First of all, as was mentioned, I was a high school teacher 30 years ago, and I always learned never get the kids right after lunch, because they're a little drowsy. So that has me nervous. The second reason I'm nervous is that this is a brand new talk, which I wrote specifically for this conference, so it may be a little rough. We've had a few AV glitches, so we'll see how it goes. And the third reason I'm nervous is that my sister-in-law and my niece are in the audience, as well as my best friend from university, Pam Scheim, who came to support me when I did my coming out speech at the school where I taught in Concord, Massachusetts, in 1988. So she has been there for me from the start. So Pam, Denise, and Jennifer, thank you for being here for me today. So I believe if we're ready to go to the PowerPoint, the title of the talk that I'm going to give you is called Beyond Marriage, What is the Future of the LGBT Movement? And it's important to realize, first of all, how incredibly far we have come. I'm probably a little more aware of this than most of you because I was born on May 8th, 1963. I'm 51. This is where you go, oh my God, you look so amazing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The world in 1963 was a dramatically different place for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people than it is today. 10 years before, President Eisenhower, in one of his first executive actions, signed Executive Order 104500, which banned employment of LGBT people by the federal government and its contractors, which meant virtually every corporation represented in this audience today. So in 1963, when I was born into a world in which you literally could not get a job if you were openly LGBT. If you were openly LGBT, you could be put in a mental hospital where you potentially would be lobotomized or castrated. And if you engaged in same-sex sexual activity, you were committing a crime in 49 out of 50 states. The only state in which it was not a criminal act to engage in same-sex sexual activity the year I was born was the state of Illinois. The attitudes towards LGBT people are kind of summed up by a CBS special called The Homosexuals, which was broadcast in 1967 and hosted by Mike Wallace, who would go on to become famous as the host of 60 Minutes. Let's watch the clip from The Homosexuals, please.
The average homosexual, if there be such, is promiscuous. He is not interested in nor capable of a lasting relationship like that of a heterosexual marriage. His sex life, his love life, consists of a series of chance encounters at the clubs and bars he inhabits, and even on the streets of the city. The one-night stand, these are characteristic of the homosexual relationship. And the homosexual prostitute has become a fixture on the downtown streets at night, on street corners, at subway exits. These young men signal their availability for pay.
It's difficult to watch this clip for two reasons. First of all, because it's so incredibly insulting and could have been broadcast as news. And secondly, it's incredibly difficult to watch physically. And the reason for that is no LGBT person dares show their actual face on television in 1967. So all of the people being filmed are in the shadows. My family shared the attitudes that were typical of the time period towards LGBT people. In fact, probably a little worse. My father was a Southern Baptist evangelist. This is an ad from one of the revivals he led shortly before I was born. And he shared the anti-gay attitudes that have come to be known today as family values. Now, there was a certain irony that my father believed in these so-called family values because of where he had learned family values from, his Uncle Mickey. My great uncle was born in 1915 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, to the mill-working family from which I am descended. There was never a lot of money working in the mills in southeastern New England in the early part of the century, and it got even worse when the Depression hit. My great uncle, though, made sure that his nieces and nephews, my father and my aunts, never knew this. When things were tight between paychecks, he somehow mysteriously appeared at my grandparents' house with bags of groceries. When birthdays or Christmas came along, he would show up with bags full of gifts so that his nephew and his nieces would never feel deprived. I grew up learning all about how my Uncle Mickey represented family. In fact, my older brother is named Mickey after him. I didn't meet Uncle Mickey because he died when I was 4 years old. And it wouldn't be until I was 40 years old that I would also learn that my great uncle was gay. Now, it could not have been very easy for someone born in 1915 to resist the pressures to get married and live a normal life, but my Uncle Mickey always did. He never married, and he lived as a single man his entire life. My Uncle Mickey would die when I was 4 years old on April 14th, 1969, as you can see here on his death certificate. He actually had been dead for several days, apparently, because my aunt found his body in his apartment where he had died some days before. If you look slightly below the date of his death, you'll see why he died: portal cirrhosis of the liver. My Uncle Mickey drank himself to death. That was the price you paid for being gay when I was a little kid. Fast forward to 2013. Here on the left, we see Edie Windsor, who, as you know, was the plaintiff, and on the right, we see my college classmate, Robbie Kaplan, who was her lawyer, emerging from the Supreme Court after having learned that they had successfully argued for the abolition of the Defense of Marriage Act. Hard to believe in the 50 years between my birth and the striking down of DOMA that so much change could occur. In fact, not just in 50 years, it's hard to believe just 10 years ago, because it was 10 years ago that Massachusetts became the first state to legalize marriage equality. Even 5 years ago, unless you lived in New England or the cornfields of Iowa, you couldn't get married to someone of the same sex. Yet here we are in 2014 when we see marriage equality spreading from coast to coast, and many LGBT people feel like this. It's gonna work? I would be offering you a slightly less joyous view of today. Yes, it's amazing to see that marriage equality has spread not only down the coast, but through the center of America. In 17 states now, you can get married if you are in love with someone of the same sex, which of course means in 33 states, you can't. If you live in a green state on this map and you are fired today because of your sexual orientation, you have a law that protects you. Actually, the green states are sexual orientation and gender identity. The yellow states are sexual orientation only. The red states, the majority of America, 29 states, there is no state law or federal law that protects you from being fired based on your sexual orientation or your gender identity. The image that we see in America, this mixed bag of places where it is supposedly safe and places where it is not, is repeated when you look around the world. If you live in one of the green countries, you have marriage equality. If you live in one of the red countries, same-sex behavior is criminalized and you could serve time in jail. If you live in one of the black countries, you can be executed for being gay. There is this misconception that progress is a linear process and things just get better and better and better over time. Yet at the same time as we're seeing progress in America, we are seeing places in the world where things are going backwards. You're undoubtedly familiar with the situation in Uganda, which passed the so-called Kill the Gays bill last December. This is what their president had to say on national television.
Do you dislike homosexuals?
Of course, they are disgusting. What sort of people are they? How can you go? I never knew what they were doing. That's how I've been told recently that what they do is terrible, disgusting.
So imagine for a second that instead of having the good fortune of being in the United States today at the Ramba conference, you instead were an LGBT activist in Uganda. This would be what your president thinks of you. So, what do we do now then? The first thing we have to do is finish the fight for legal equality. We have got to continue fighting until in every state and in every country, LGBT people are safe, free, and equal and do not have to live in fear of losing their jobs or losing their lives because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity. But we also need to realize a second thing, which is that legal equality is the end of the beginning, not the beginning of the end of the work we need to do. And if you'll bear with me for a second, as a former history teacher, I'd like to give a little history lesson. This is Martin Luther King in August 1963, when I was 5 months old, giving the I Have a Dream speech. The result of the I Have a Dream speech, as you know, and the movement that Martin Luther King and other leaders, such as the openly gay organizer of that march, Bayard Rustin, was the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which President Johnson signed into law 50 years ago, supposedly ending the problem of discrimination based on race. I say supposedly because there's still facts like this out there. Inconvenient, pesky facts, such as the fact that over the last 40 years, the median income of white people, which is the blue line, and the median income of black people, which is the red line, has remained grossly unequal, and we have basically seen no real change. When you look at the issue of wealth, not income, the disparity has not only not gotten better, it has actually gotten worse. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 came at a time when we saw images like this. This is from the famous Birmingham March in the week I was born, May 1963, when African-American teenagers rallied against segregation and were set upon by fire hoses and police attack dogs. Many of you probably grew up seeing these images in your history class as young people and finding it hard to believe that you were growing up in a country where we could see the authorities turn violence loose against black people. Hard to believe, right? This is Ferguson, Missouri, 6 weeks ago. Exactly how much progress have we made? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 not only banned discrimination based on race, it also banned it based on sex. If so, why is it that women continue to make pennies on the dollar compared to men? In 1960, before the Civil Rights Act, they made about 60 cents for every dollar a man made. In 2014, it has improved to 79 cents, but we still have a gap of 21% difference between men and women. In 1991, President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disability Act, supposedly banning discrimination based upon the ability of people. Explain why then, over the last 30 years, things have not actually gotten better for people with disabilities. The blue line is the rates of employment for people without disabilities. The red line is the rate of employment of people with disabilities. You actually see that the disparity between people with disabilities and those without has gotten worse since the passage of the Americans with Disability Act. So, laws are necessary, but they're insufficient to achieve equality. We know this ourselves in the LGBT community. Many of you probably recognize this image of a young college student named Matthew Shepard. Matthew Shepard, in October of 1998, was taken by 2 other young men, tied to a fence and beaten, and left there to die. This is the fence he was tied to. Now, you probably also know that because of Matthew's death, the movement for hate crimes laws got a new sense of energy, and in 2010, President Obama signed the James Byrd and Matthew Shepard Hate Crimes Prevention Act into law, supposedly solving the problem of violence towards LGBT people. Tell that to Mark Carson. Mark Carson was a gay New Yorker who was walking down 6th Avenue at 12th Street, 8 blocks from where I live in New York City, in the so-called gay ghetto of Chelsea. In May of last year, when a young man approached him, started screaming faggot at him, and shot him in the face. This is Christopher Bryant. Christopher Bryant is a newspaper editor in London, where I live now. Christopher was walking through a park in Bromley last May, the day after Mark Carson was killed, when he was set upon by a group of thugs screaming homophobic epithets at him. This is what Christopher Bryant looked like after his attack. This is Elon Nettles. Elon Nettles is a transgender teenager who was walking across the street from a police station in Harlem last August when she was set upon by a group of anti-trans thugs and beaten to death. Across the street from the police station. Now, the frightening thing about this is what happened to Elon is hardly unique. The red countries are countries where we have reported data about the attacks made on trans people. And we know that over the last 5 years, 1,518 trans people have been murdered around the globe. It's actually worse because from the gray countries, we have no data at all. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us this. Laws guarantee equality, but equality doesn't mean justice. I love this cartoon because what it does is it illustrates the difference between equality and justice. Equality is giving everybody the same thing, which is what you see on the left, which leaves some people still unable to participate in the game. Justice is giving people what they need to have an equal chance to take part. Now, if you watch TV, you wouldn't know any of this. We have images like Mitch and Cam from my personal favorite TV show, Modern Family, where it really does seem like the problems of gay people are kind of all solved, aren't they? Well, I think we have a problem here. I think we need to adopt a new slogan, which is leave no LGBT people behind. Frankly, things are pretty good for gay people like me, who are white, educated, and affluent. That is not most gay people. This is a look at LGBT youth. 6% of teenagers in America identify as LGBT. 40% of teenagers who are homeless identify as LGBT. In other words, a disproportionate ratio by a matter of over 600%. Sexual orientation and gender identity clearly matter, but they're not the only thing that matters. This is looking at the percentage of children living in poverty in America. If you are a married, different sex household, or as my friend likes to call it, a mixed marriage, you are the bar on the far right. Only about 8% of children living in heterosexual-headed homes live in poverty. About 15% of those living in the color's all screwed up. The 4 columns are heterosexual, male same-sex, female, and then African-American same-sex households. So you'll see that, yes, if you are any child growing up in a gay home, you're more likely to live in poverty, but you're much more likely to live in poverty if your parents are both black and gay. Your gender matters. This is the percentage of people getting food stamps. Green is the percentage of straight couples getting food stamps. Red is the percentage of gay male couples getting food stamps. Blue is the percentage of lesbian couples getting food stamps. So your gender matters as well. Now, what's my point in bringing all these points forward? Well, I would like to take you back 30 years if I could. I'm the kid in the middle with the white t-shirt with the red ringer at his first gay pride march in 1985. How many of you were at your first LGBT event like this? Anybody? So I'm you 30 years ago. And I've been doing this work for 3 decades. And I've learned some basic things about it, which is, as Matt said in his remarks, yes, we are at a very exciting moment in our movement, but we are far from over. One of my favorite politicians is the British Labour Minister, Tony Benn, who once said, every single generation has to fight the same battles over and over again. There is no final victory, and there is no final defeat. It is incredibly exciting to have experienced the victories we've experienced in the last year, but they are not guaranteed forever, and we have to continue to work to secure the rights that we have yet to win. Now I want to speak specifically to the Ramba audience, and I speak to you as an NYU Stern alum with an MBA of his own. Stern people, come on, that deserves an applause, come on. This is the percentage of Americans who have degrees. And you can see that people with professional degrees represent about 15% of all people in America. So you belong to a very, very slender slice of our society. Now, they will tell you, as Andy Warhol once said, that time changes things, but actually you have to change them yourself. There used to be an advertisement for Amex, which used to say membership has its privileges. Well, you have membership in a very small elite in American society, and that brings with it privileges. It also brings with it responsibilities. Responsibilities to use your power for those who are not as lucky as you are. Now, I was doing this in my office, and one of my coworkers, Cindy Rizzo, said, Kevin, I'm Jewish. You're making me feel guilty. I have no interest in making you feel guilty. I have an interest in inspiring you to take action. Where do you take that action? Well, follow the advice of my favorite bisexual American hero, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was one of the authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She was asked the day the Declaration was enacted, well, where do universal human rights begin? And she said, in small places close to home. We have this tendency to think that human rights begins in Washington or in London or in Brussels. But the reality is, human rights begins where you live. So take a stand there. Stand in your workplace, stand in your community, stand in your schools, or the schools your kids attended, or the schools that you attended. Get out of your comfort zone. We've got to realize that no one will be free until everyone is free. Now, when I ask you to take action, I'm asking you to do 2 things. You have 2 things that most Americans don't have. Skills, because you have advanced degrees, and you have money. First-year associate at McKinsey, according to the web, makes $130,000 a year. A family of 4 in America makes $51,000 a year. So there's no doubt that all of us in this room are economically privileged. Like I said, I don't want you to feel guilty. I want you to use those things. Use your skills by joining a board of a local LGBT nonprofit. Use your skills by mentoring a young person, such as a scholar affiliated with the Point Foundation. Use your skills to help benefit your community. And use your economic privilege. The fact is, a study by the Movement Advancement Project found that only 3% of LGBT people give to LGBT organizations. 97% of our community sits on the sidelines. So I don't want you to leave today feeling bad that you have an MBA or bad that hopefully you'll get a good salary. I want you to leave feeling like I've got some things that can help my community and to use those things to help your community. Why should you do that? Because of the people who came before who made it possible for you to be where you are today. I don't know if you recognize this magazine. It's called One. It was the first LGBT rights magazine in America, beginning its printing in 1953. The first issue of one was seized by the US Postal Service because even though it had no visual images in it, the very fact that it talked about homosexuality got it deemed pornography. The editors of one decided to not stand for it, and they sued. They sued the United States of America. And we talked about the DOMA decision earlier, and we were all very excited about the Supreme Court's actions in May of 2013. But we really should be excited about the Supreme Court's actions in October of 1956, when it made its first ruling on LGBT rights by ruling that one magazine had a right to be mailed through the US mail. This is a very early issue. It's from October of 1954. And they got a legal opinion about what they would be allowed to print, and their lawyer had said, you just can't print it. And they decided to print their magazine anyway. And I read all of the issues of One magazine when I was in graduate school for a thesis I was writing. And I read the letters to the editor, which were the most moving part to me, because people couldn't even sign their names in the 50s to the letters to the editor to One magazine. All they could do was sign where they were from. And this letter has always stayed with me. I will always remain willing to support, in my small way, any effort to reduce tolerance toward a minority group in the United States. Intolerance is basically as un-American as communism. This is 1954, please remember. The real message, though, is in the last line. I realize the road ahead of us is long and difficult, but that part of the road already traveled has been pretty tough, too. The road ahead of us is long and difficult. We live in a world where 1,500 trans people have been killed in the last 5 years. We live in a country where you can be fired from your job in 29 states. We live in a world in which you can be executed in 7 countries. We have much work to do. But the part of the road already traveled, that was a lot more tough. Think back to when I was born in 1963. Think back to when my Uncle Mickey died in 1969, 9 weeks before the Stonewall riot. Think back to the courage of the people who stood up in the 50s and 60s and said, this has got to stop. Think about the fact that the only reason we are able to be here today is because they had the courage to stand up and fight back in a much darker time than we face today. And let that inspire you to take your own stand. Here's what I found most moving about this letter. As I mentioned, they couldn't sign their names, but they could sign where they were from. This author was from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the city I would grow up in. 10 years later, I would be born and grow up in Winston-Salem. 26 years later, after this letter was written and published, when I was 16 years old, I would try to take my own life because I saw no future for myself as a gay person. But in my hometown, a decade before I was born, there was someone who was standing up and saying, it has got to be better for the next generation. You are that next generation. It has gotten better for you. And that carries with it some responsibility. And that responsibility is to take the education you have, to take the economic resources you have, to take the skills you have, and to fight as hard as you can to make sure the next generation of LGBT people is even freer than you are. That's your duty. Go out and do your duty to your community. Thank you. Thank you. I think I finished in time to take 1 or 2 questions. And we talked to the AV people. There's no way with how crowded the room is that they're going to be able to get you a mic. So if you have a question, stand up and yell it out. I see a hand in the back. You better have a gym teacher voice. It's a great question. I'll repeat the question. What should Americans be doing to help the situation of LGBT people in countries that are not as fortunate as ours, including Russia, where the questioner comes from? We've been very involved at the Arcus Foundation, which, as was mentioned by Matt, is the largest funder of LGBT rights in the world, with the situation in Russia. And the most appalling thing I learned when the entire Russia crisis started 18 months ago was this. There are 11 people who work full-time for gay rights in Russia. 11 in a country of 150 million people. So we started a thing called the Russia Freedom Fund, and you can go to russiafreedomfund.org right now and give money, and 100% of your gift goes directly to Russian LGBT organizations. But the second thing I think we need to do is to recognize it's not just Russia, it's Uganda, it's Nigeria, it's India. There are many, many countries where we're facing these challenges. And what business can do is play a uniquely powerful role, because all of these countries want American business. And if business leaders start to say, like they did during apartheid to South Africa, we simply aren't going to do business with you as long as you engage in these discriminatory behaviors. I think it would have an enormous impact in getting those countries to change their policies. It worked in South Africa around the issue of race. There's no reason it can't work in a place like Russia or Nigeria around the issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. So don't just take a stand yourself. Get your company to take a stand. One more question. You're MBA students, you're not shy. Okay, I'll go back there. Okay, we'll go to follow-up then, all right. The question is, what do I think of divestiture as a tool to put pressure on anti-gay states? And you were using the example of Russia, where we have significant banking and energy interests. I think this is a really tough issue. And I cut my teeth as part of the divestiture movement for South Africa back in the early 80s, my first arrest. So I think it shouldn't be your first step, though, because when you divest, you immediately lose your leverage. I think instead, the first thing corporations should do is literally sit down with their Russian authorities or the Nigerian authorities or the Ugandan authorities and say, if you want our business, this is what you need to do. And the clock is ticking. Then if they refuse to take action, then I think you escalate from there. Divestiture is an option, but I think it should be something you do at the end of the road. It should not be step one. It should be your final step. I mean, the reality is, Shell's in Nigeria. Exxon is in Nigeria. These companies have enormous leverage in those places. Don't be afraid to use it. Frankly, they need you more than you need them. The question is, how likely are they to use that leverage? I think without pressure from their own employees and from the public, zero. So I think that you, as current and future employees of these companies, have to make your voices heard. The fact is, the reason apartheid came to an end wasn't because white people in South Africa woke up someday and said, oh my gosh, we've been so mean. We're really sorry. It came to an end because their economy was collapsing, because more and more companies were saying, we're not going to collaborate with a racist regime, because their own customers and their own employees said, I can't deal with this. I won't work here. I won't buy your products if you collaborate with those kind of people. We need to see the same pressure on American companies. You have a 3 o'clock session, please go. By the way, if you ever need to find me, arcusfoundation.org. You can click through, and we have a couple of announcements, so I'll turn the floor back to Matt.
Thank you again. Please join us in giving a big thank you to Kevin Jennings.